Hi everybody and welcome to the End of the World Reading Club September meeting. And hopefully you are viewing us on the platform of your choice. Now you may have spotted in the chat, this is an experiment for us this month. We are using a new service which means that we can put this out over Facebook and YouTube and Twitter all at the same time. So hopefully it's working, and where you are you can see us and you can hear us. This is in preparation for the festival starting in about a month's time. So we'd really appreciate it if you could give us any feedback of things that are going well, things that are going badly, so that we've got a bit of time to fix things. If for whatever reason there's issues to do with this stream, we are going to be recording the feed as normal, and we'll upload a better version of it to Facebook and to YouTube later on in the week, or even start of next week, I guess, as it's Sunday. So we're here today to talk about this awesome book, The Calculating Stars, by Mary Robinette Kowal. I haven't quite got the pronunciation down, I think, for her first name yet. This is a brilliant book, and I'm so pleased that we're going to be talking about it today, because I think there's loads in here to discuss. It was very popular, it won lots of awards, so hopefully some of you out there have read it and have got some opinions, or that you're just interested in hearing me talk about it today, and it might prompt you to go away and read it yourself. As always, we're going to focus on the themes and the ideas in the story rather than every single plot point, but there will of course be plenty of spoilers in there. If you are interested in going into it cold, I would recommend that you maybe don't watch all this video today, go away and read it, and then join us in the comments when we've uploaded the video to our channels in the future, because it'd be great to hear what you think about this book and all the other books previously. You may also spot there's a little link on the screen, quite small, kept it subtle. This is for Ko-Fi, which is a live, which is like a crowdfunding service where you can give a small amount to support people are making content you love. We've just had a nice crowdfunder which was going to help us meet our goals of running the festival this year, but the Ko-Fi is a kind of more regular, just drop a little bit in, which helps us pay for things like the streaming service that we're using today, and upgrading our kit in the future. So it's a kind of keeping this system going, keeping the book club going, not only now but throughout the year, because we're going to continue doing these for as long as we've got books to read and want to talk about. So that's all the introductions, I suppose. So hopefully you're all sitting comfortably. I've had my 2 coffees this morning, so I'm ready to go. Hopefully you are too, and that you'll enjoy hearing about this book and what I think of it. Please do leave any comments when you like. It's going to be really useful to see how they pop up on this system, so even if it's just to say hi and what platform you're on, at least I can see how it works, which would be really useful for me and our planning in the future. So that's all the admin over. That's like 5 minutes of admin. I do apologise. Let's get into the book. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette. It was published first in the US in 2018 and then in the UK in 2019, and that's the edition I've got there. If you want to know more about my book collection, you can watch that video that we did about my book collection. And also this was one of the books that I bought in my kind of August haul, where I just bought loads of books in one big splurge. This was one that I'd seen a lot of information about, and I was really intrigued to hear about it and to read it and to kind of get into that world, because it's one of a series of books. And as I'm sure you've gathered by now, I love it when there's a trilogy or more, and I can really get invested in the story over a long period of time. So the book won the Nebula in 2018 and then the Hugo Award in 2019. I think, like a lot of the books that we cover on the book club, they tend to have been ones that have been really well regarded by the industry and by judges and award panels, but they haven't necessarily become massive Game of Thrones style hits. So it still feels like it's nice to talk about them to people that maybe haven't heard of them it wasn't something that I'd come across until quite recently myself. So hopefully you'll enjoy that story too. Hi Laura. Excellent. You're very welcome, and I'm glad it's working on YouTube. That's really positive. So let's talk a little bit about the author first, because she's fascinating, and I'd highly recommend that you subscribe to her YouTube channel, and also follow her on social media, because she's full of interesting opinions and ideas. And I encourage you to go and read her Wikipedia as well, because her life is really interesting on its own. So she started as a puppeteer. That's how she trained, and worked for a little bit for the Jim Henson Company. I think she maybe auditioned for Sesame Street, and worked on Lazy Town, which is this very idiosyncratic Icelandic show, kids show. So puppetry is kind of her background, and I think that's we probably won't get into that too much today, but is interesting. And also she spent time being an audiobook narrator, and that is going to be more relevant to what we're going to talk about today. And this world, this narrative world, started in that sphere, in that there was a audible compilation that she wrote a short story for, or a novella for, and the pitch was that you had to write something that was inspired by a first line, and she picked the first line from the Wizard of Oz, and that idea of "we're not on Kansas anymore" will come back into our discussion a bit later on. So she wrote these. She wrote this story. I'm gonna have to lean over because I need to do this. So that's Laura saying hi. Hello, Laura, and this is friend of the festival, Stephen, saying there's a slight delay. I'm not sure I can do anything about that today, but I'm going to work on that for next time, because I've got some plans in place. So the novella was written. I'm not going to spoil that too much, and I'm kind of treating it slightly separate to this, but it was called The Lady Astronaut of Mars. It was set in a far future, and essentially this novel is a prequel to that story. It's the author looking at that person, that character, and their relationship and their circumstance, and then imagining where all that began, and then writing that story. There's a really fascinating kind of author's note at the end, which talks about some of the challenges that if you've created a world for a novella, and then how some of the constrictions you have to work with then when you're making a full story. So I'd highly recommend you read that novella as well, but we're not going to talk about that too much today, because they're kind of designed to operate independently, and that's how I'm going to treat them. So the pitch, the kind of elevator pitch for the story, if I was pitching this to a publisher, I suppose, it's set in the 1950s, where a disaster has fallen the Earth, and there's a realization that humanity's got to go to the stars. They've got to go to the moon and eventually Mars to create kind of colonies to escape Earth being an inhospitable place. This is quite a traditional sci-fi story, I think, and I'm going to talk later on about at least one book that I've read which tackles a similar idea in a very different way. But there's some catches here, and one of which is that it's an alternative history. Quite often when you get these stories, they're set in the modern day or the near future or even the far future. So you can do lots of whiz-bang technology, and you haven't got to worry so much about orbital ballistics and all the rest of it. This is set in the 1950s. So the world that we are in have got to try and deal with that scenario with 1950s technology. And our story is told by the Lady Astronaut of Mars, who is a computer, a human computation person, who's also been a pilot during the Second World War. So it comes to this challenge with a unique skill set of being able to do lots of complicated maths in her head, but also knows how to fly a plane. And the story is kind of her journey to becoming an astronaut, the Lady Astronaut of Mars. So this is spoilery, but it's not too spoilery, because as we'll talk about a bit when we get onto the things that I think are worth discussing section, it's not necessarily a story with dramatic hairpin turns and twists. We kind of know the destination, and what we are doing is we're following the journey. And we'll talk a bit maybe about what that's like as a reader and how that fits in with kind of contemporary ways of working. And the book is split into 2 parts, so we're now getting into slightly spoiler territory. So if you're spoiler averse, this is the time to mute or check out and come back and watch it afterwards when you've read the book. So part 1 is set in 1952, and this is essentially a combination of the film Deep Impact and the television series designated Survivor, I suppose, in that what happens is a meteorite hits the Earth at Washington DC, wipes out the American government, apart from somebody who happened to be away, who ends up being the designated survivor, I suppose. And then the 1952 is a world where people are trying to figure out how to deal with this catastrophe. And our character, Elmer, who is our POV narrator, is quick to realise, along with friends and her husband Nathaniel, that this is going to mean a kind of dinosaur extinction level event, and we've got to get out of Dodge pretty quickly. So that's part 1, and then part 2 moves forward a few years to 1956, and the kind of story of the kind of practical realisation of how you would go from Earth to orbit, and then planning for eventually the Moon and Mars. This is part 1 of 2 or 3 books, so it was written as kind of part 1 of 2 in terms of telling a story about getting to the Moon, and the struggles of the characters to, and particularly our main character, to become one of those astronauts and getting out there into space. So that is the kind of overarching plot. Hopefully that's not spoiling too much about what actually happens. Like I say, it's kind of set up so you already kind of know there's going to be success, and it's the journey that's the interesting thing. And I wanted to talk very briefly about the tone of the story. So the thing that really fascinated me about the book is that it's got quite a pleasing kind of golden age 1950s vibe to it. In some ways, and this is kind of the highest kind of praise, it felt like reading something like the Isaac Asimov of the 1950s, but crucially with some really modern twists. So the language that people use is more grown up. Some of the activities between consenting adults and otherwise is a bit more grown up than you would find in the Asimov of the 1950s, but there's a pleasing kind of retro feel to the way the story is told, and that's not a criticism, it's a massive plus. And when I was doing sort of my research into the author, I found an interview where she was talking about her previous series, which was a Regency fantasy story, and the lengths that she went to make sure that the language that she was talking about was, the language she was using was Austen appropriate. So creating a dictionary of Jane Austen dialogue, and then doing your spell check, and then swapping out words when they didn't fit with the vernacular. And although I don't think she did that quite here with the 1950s, it has a similar feel to me of attention to detail. So if you're yearning for that kind of more writers who are writing in that kind of way but with a modern twist, then this is a book that you should really get into and tackle, I think. The other thing that she talks about previously that definitely has an influence on how this is working and how it sounds is that it's a POV character, and she talked in some of the interviews when it was released about the influence of being an audiobook narrator. And this really it feels like a story that's written to be told. So I think it's really nice that it's part of her writing practice for this, was informed by her previous experience. Maybe less on the puppetry on this one, although I think it's probably got some influences there. But I think when you read it, if you've not read it, you can kind of bear that kind of point of view in mind. So I thought I'd mention briefly some of the themes of the book, because I think these are things we might talk about. So if you've read it and you've got some opinions on this, start leaving them in the chat, and then we'll kind of feed them in as we kind of get onto the open discussion section. One thing that really surprised me is that this is kind of a book about climate emergency. I didn't really expect it to be a book about the climate emergency, but it really is. And we'll talk a bit, I think, about the meteorite and what that represents as we move on. It's also a book about grief. So one of the things that happens really early on is our lead character and her husband are away from Washington, away from their family, away from most of the people they know when disaster strikes. So they are survivors. Now, they don't have survivor's guilt, but they do have to cope with the fact that it's a global emergency and people they know have died. That felt to me incredibly resonant for this year, as I'm sure it would to you. And that was a surprise. I didn't really expect that I would be in that position where I was reflecting on this year when I got into the story. Really interesting. Really interesting. It's also a book then following on from that about how people respond to adversity. This is an incredibly challenging world, but it's an incredibly challenging world, but I think a really interesting one. I'm just pausing because I've got a great comment here about puppetry from Laura who's watching. There we go, this is Laura's comment about her experiences of puppetry in the second book. Well, that's amazing. I'm going to definitely look forward to that when I read that one, because I've not read the second book yet, so it means I can't spoil it by accident, which is also, I think, quite positive. So yeah, this is a book about people responding to adversity. So the massive challenges that humanity faces and how they deal with them. And I've been thinking quite a lot recently about how, as humanity, we look at the climate emergency and how we can work together to make a change. And I think this book is a model for the ways that people could work together and overcome politics and prejudice to act collectively to an emergency. It's also a book for me about intersectionality and allies and prejudice, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, about how that comes across in the book. It's also, I think for me, there's something really nice about it, that this is a book about a decent person who does make some mistakes and apologises for them, and is a hero and not an anti-hero. And again, we'll probably come back to this a little bit later, but I think that's something that's rarer these days. And it's something that I kind of want to get into, this idea of stories and stories about the people that are in stories. And on the book club, we've read quite a lot of stories which have got some characters that aren't always sympathetic. So it was really nice and refreshing to read a story where that wasn't the case. Although I think it'd be good for us to maybe talk about how realistic that was. And I suppose it maybe harks back to some of that kind of golden age and the kind of updating of the golden age styles, which is people who have got a real solid moral core, but with the modern twist being that they do also have flaws and they're not kind of perfect agents, and how that works. It's also a book for me about humanity and empathy, but also celebrities and role models. I think this is really interesting stuff for contemporary society. And it's also, and this is a bit spoilery, I suppose, about anxiety and about mental health, and how we think about people that suffer from those things in relation to the jobs they do and what they can achieve. And again, a nice kind of modern take on some of those ideas, looking back to the 1950s. So before we get into that kind of wider discussion, so start thinking about your comments and things you want to talk about. There's some things I noticed. Firstly, the book begins with a quote from Richard II. It's a quote about, it's useful because it's got meteors in it and moons, and it's kind of like sign of the time stuff. But it's also a quote that was delivered in Richard II by an unnamed character, a Welsh captain, and it felt to me that was really representative of the fact that in the story the main characters are kind of unnamed. So the bit I haven't mentioned just yet, I suppose, is that most of the main characters we get in here are women or men and women of colour who face massive prejudice in their ideas and their dreams. So for all of the people in this story who want to become astronauts and go into space that we follow and that there are kind of heroes, They're people that in real life were involved but were excluded from history. So this is not only a kind of alt history science fiction story, it's also akin to something like Hidden Figures. And in an interview she talks about the fact that although this came out before Hidden Figures or around the same time, it was brilliant because her early readers, their response was, well, this is, having women and black men involved in NASA in the 1950s and 60s is incredibly unrealistic. We haven't heard of any of them. It's just kind of white men. And then Hidden Figures came out, which demonstrated that that wasn't true. And what has happened was that people were involved and they've been kind of written out of history. And that is a starting point for how she wants to write as well. Again, we'll kind of come back to that. And I just like to think that that quote from Richard II was useful for the telling of the story for those two reasons. The other thing that I really liked, and I noticed right at the beginning, is that she makes it very clear from the first proper line, I think, that that this is not set quite in our universe. So the very first words are President Dewey. Page 1, chapter 1, President Dewey. So immediately I knew, because I kind of knew from the back of the book what the story was about, but I knew it wasn't quite set in our world. And the choice here apparently was that she wanted a president in charge that wasn't Truman, so Dewey was who Truman was up against, who would be more receptive to, or that it his election would have represented a slightly different government who would be more likely to respond to the emergency in the way that they needed to, whereas Truman's government might have been a bit different. But I just like that immediately you knew we weren't quite in the same world that we were in, and that was a really nice touch, I thought. The other thing that I really noticed quite early on was a kind of a slight little comment which I think informs the world how she sees it today. So what happens is a meteorite hits the Earth, and all the way through part 1, American officials and news outlets are calling it meteors, a meteor rather than a meteorite, and they are different things. And the UK news source that's kind of quoted in here does call it a meteorite. And I think there's a little dig there to the unscientific nature of America today, and perhaps a loss of focus on the actual precise nature of things. Because in a way, it doesn't matter. A meteorite or a meteorite, the thing has caused the damage, it's caused the apocalypse, but it represents an attention to detail in science communication, which perhaps she thinks America isn't doing. And in part 1, our titular character, Elmer, she's correcting people to say it's a meteorite. The other thing that was warming of my heart was that our festival name is in part inspired by a song called Cosmia by an artist called Joanna Newsom, whose sister is an astrophysicist. And that song talks about meteors and meteorites and the difference, but deliberately gets it wrong as a kind of like wind up to her sister, I think. So it also reminded me of this song that helped inspire our name. So it was very pleasing. The other thing to note, and I watched a review of this that found this quite negative, is that the beginning of the story is incredibly filmic. It's that kind of deep impact disaster movie start. And then the story morphs into something else. It becomes somebody's journey against adversity and prejudice, and a kind of how you get from one point to another. I didn't find that change too jarring, because what I thought was really good about that was that it was the character got that thing at the beginning, which was the driver of the plot and this kind of trauma, and I felt that the story carried that trauma all the way through. She carried it with her all the way through, and that was important for her character and her character development. But I can appreciate that you might read the first bit and think, I know what I'm in for here, and then it changes and you're maybe a bit unsure about where it's gone to. The other thing I thought we might want to do is to unpack the title, because I probably didn't think about the title until I read the whole book and then was thinking about what I want to say here. the calculating stars, which I guess works on several levels. Our main character and a lot of the other people in her life are human computers, so they are calculating all the time. Stars are involved because they are going to the stars. But I think there's another level there which informs what the story is talking about, which is actually about, it's the flip side of Hidden Figures. This is people who calculate and who become stars because of what they're trying to do. And that's very much Elmer's journey, is kind of expert to celebrity to different kind of expert, which is a really great career path to kind of dig into, I think. Another thing that I kind of noted to myself as I was going through was that I've read a book within the last couple of years. I would show it to you, but it's in storage. If you want to know more about all the books that I own, we have a video for that, which I'll add a link to in the comments at the end, or you can find on our YouTube channel. Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson. Neil Stephenson, I think, like Mary Robinette Kowal, is an author that likes to get the facts right and the science right. There's a lot in here about consulting with mathematicians and astrophysicists to make sure everything is as accurate as it can be. And Seven Eves is also humanity trying to flee the planet. It's based in the science, but it's based in the future, and a very different take on it. Neil Stephenson's a very different kind of writer, but and it's a very hard sci-fi version. This isn't a hard sci-fi version. This is a kind of, it's an alternate history kind of social story as much as anything else, which I think made it so fascinating. But I like that this very same inspiration as an idea can have two very different outputs. Also, Seven Eves is quite bleak. Characters go through a lot of challenges and it doesn't end well, whereas I think what's nice about this book, as a flip side to that, is that it's a lot more positive. Bad things happen, but also good things happen, and it's a nice kind of having those two sides of the coin. The last little point that I think I wanted to bring up here, as to kind of come on discussion at the end, is that there's a really steady pace to this story. I think that probably harks back to the 1950s as well, and the way that stories were being told. It's all about small battles. After that initial kind of event, it becomes something that is a lot more kind of steady, and you're invested in the small victories. And that's something that I don't think you get very often in science fiction, and was really nice to get it here, because you really come to root for Elmer and her friends and colleagues, especially when they're challenging adversity or prejudice, and they succeed. It kind of gives you a happy buzz, and that is different from some spaceships winning a space battle or anything that's in that kind of bigger concept, but as valid for me. So here's what I think it's trying to do. So I was just getting my water there. I think that this story is, like all good science fiction, using the past as a proxy for now. And actually, this is what she talks about. She talks about science fiction and fantasy taking the real world, tipping it over to the side so you can see all the gaps in between. Now, I think in that context, she's talking about art history and about, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I think also the story is very good about talking about the world today and examining our world today through a kind of historical science fiction context to allow us to reflect on where we are today. And my pitch for that is that the meteorite, the thing that hits America in the 1950s and kind of accelerates the end of the world, or the end of this kind of epoch, I think we're the meteorite. I'm not sure whether that's what the author intended, but that's very much my reading. If you think about, and here's my justification, if you think about the 1950s and you think about America, and that is the age where capitalism and consumerism kicks off. Think about Mad Men. Think about the boom in consumer products in the invention of plastics and packaging, the globalization of production starting, and kind of rapid growth being the thing that everybody's most important about. That's the 1950s for me in America. If you were to go on a very left field illusion, watch episode 8 of the last season of Twin Peaks, which I'm not going to spoil for you. I think that's maybe telling a similar story with the atom bomb, slightly earlier maybe. But that with the meteorite, Western civilization hits in America in the 1950s, and then just like the impact of the meteorite, ripples out across the world. And at the time, a few people noted that what this might mean. Environmentalism, the CND, these are all kind of bubbling up at that time. But this is an alternate world where the crisis was more immediate, and the people who noticed the crisis were articulate about saying what it was and convincing policymakers, enough policymakers, that something had to happen. And I think there's a bit of an indictment there on the way that our world is currently dealing with the climate emergency and not treating it as an emergency and not being able to see into the future enough to know what's coming and try and fix it. I'm not suggesting we flee the planet to fix it, because we haven't been hit with a meteorite, but I think there's something there that maybe we can unpack a little bit more over the next kind of half an hour or so. The other thing that the story is trying to do, I know this because of the way she talks about it and from that quote. The way that the author starts with the story is to, when she's got an inspiration for a period, is to look at who is excluded from that narrative, from that story. So she looked at NASA, she loves NASA and the story of it, she looked at it, and this is before Hidden Figures, remember, and thought, who isn't in this story that should be in this story? If you were writing a history book about the beginnings of NASA and the mission to the moon, who do we not talk about? And then she's written a story, a fictional story, which foregrounds those people, and I think that's brilliant. Really, and it was really nice to get that confirmation that that's what she was thinking about. So, I thought I'd move on. I'll give you a little bit of an idea of the characters in this story, because it'd be good to get your thoughts on them. And I'm going to talk about 3 kind of main characters, and then the kind of constellation of other characters around them. So firstly, our narrator, Elmer. So Elmer is, as I said, a kind of maths genius who was also a pilot in the Second World War as a WASP. And female pilots in the Second World War were supposed to be kind of supply pilots. They weren't trusted to be fighter pilots. Even though they ended up getting involved in situations, they often struggled because they didn't have ammunition. So they had to be very quick on there to think about solutions and to problem solve. Useful skills, you might think, for an astronaut. Also, she's very calm under the kind of pressures that an astronaut needs to deal with. There's an emergency on your orbiting spacecraft or at a rocket launch. This is kind of when she's in her Zen place, making calculations quickly, thinking clearly and decisively in crises. And we get a really good introduction to this at the beginning when the meteorite hits, when she's away with her husband and they are able to kind of fly away from trouble. She's calm under pressure, so we get that immediately. The author talks a bit about how Elmer is based on her grandmother, a kind of old southern lady, and just the way that she talked and the way that she presented herself and her kind of calmness. So it does feel like a really personal representation to me. Elmer's a really fleshed out character. The only thing I think I had some reservations about was, is she a bit too good? I know I've kind of mentioned previously about the benefits of having a character that is got a moral centre and makes mistakes. But I would like to hear from you whether you think she's maybe just a little bit too kind of clean and pure. I suppose there's an element here which is she's telling her story after it's all happened. So we're getting her view on things. I don't think she's written as a unreliable narrator, but you might want to bring that reading it to yourself, and that she's telling her story in a kind of authorized autobiography kind of way, where you're giving your view on every situation. But she is a complex character because she does have a lot of stuff going on. And she does make mistakes. Some of those are in relation to her club, the 99, and particularly not picking up on prejudices that other people face. She's a Jewish woman who's seen Jewish people go through the Holocaust, has been a woman in very male-dominated environments, like in the Air Force during the war, and has had to deal with prejudice. But the story is a bit of a learning experience for her that other people face challenges. They face challenges for being a woman, but also for being a person of colour, not just in terms of the Black American experience, and yeah. So maybe there is a bit of growth there in terms of how she thinks about the world. Yeah, Laura, I think that's definitely the case, that she could maybe do with a few more little flaws, perhaps. So let's move on to one of those examples, which is the relationship she has with her husband, Nathaniel. He's also a major character in this story because he is he's a rocket scientist. So they are an amazing couple to have survive a meteorite strike, because she can do all the maths and the flying, and he can do all of the kind of engineering and the planning side of things. So one thing that again was very refreshing, but I think is worth talking about, is that they have got an incredibly strong relationship. Now, there's good reasons for this in terms of how this story came about. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's a prequel to a novella, and in the novella, Elmer and Nathaniel are still together, dealing with challenges at the time. But this is kind of an origin story of what is a very healthy and respectful marriage. What I really liked about this was that it felt like a challenge to lots of fiction where authors feel like they have to make the relationship dysfunctional, that it has to be a driver of the plot or of character development. Whereas actually, it was nice to read a story where it was a supportive relationship of mutual respect, and they kind of work together. They have their arguments and disagreements, but they support each other, and that wasn't an area of drama. I can see how for some readers that would feel like, what's the point? But for me, Elmer's kind of strong moral core and strong base would have been undermined if her relationship hadn't also had that same aspect to it. But yeah, let us know what you think about that relationship in the comments. Then our third character is where the drama comes in, and this is Parker. He is he's the experienced astronaut. He's and the person that Elmer knows from the past, who is a misogynist and is unreasonable and is the source of a lot of drama and tension, and represents the 1950s view on women and women's place in society, and sadly a lot of men's view on women and their place in society still today, kind of going back to that mirror on today's society and today's world. So I think Parker's interesting, and I suppose as the story develops, you do get a bit more of a fleshed out sense of him, but possibly for a good chunk of the story, he's kind of an unreasonable villain. You need a villain in there, and I can appreciate that if you've got somebody who's got a really strong moral core, you kind of need the opposite. But I think I'd have liked him to maybe have a few more redeeming features. I think that does develop a little bit over time, and he shows a little bit more vulnerability without wanting to get into spoilers. But yeah, I'm hopeful as I get into the kind of second and third book that some of those adversaries and some of those challengers start to get their own complex narrative and stories. And then we've got the supporting characters. And these are, I'm going to call the 99s. Essentially, this is the bulk of this are friends of Elmer's or compatriots of Elmer's who are pilots or computers. It's a kind of girls' squad mostly, although there are men in there involved as well. And having this kind of collection of women who, some of whom want to be astronauts as well, or they want to be pilots, or are on the computing side, allows the author to demonstrate the range of prejudices and experiences that women, particularly the 1950s, went through and would have gone through in this context. And it allows us to see Elmer's response to these characters as well. And as I mentioned before, her blinkers on prejudice and who has challenges in society, but also the way that she evolves. And there's some really nice characters in there. I think my only concern is that there's a lot of them, and keeping a track on who they all are and how they all relate was something I found a little bit difficult here and there. But they help flesh out the story. And the other thing that they really bring is humour. And this is something that, again, you don't get a lot in apocalyptic flee the planet fiction, I think. It's got some really funny moments in it, and there's a real camaraderie, which I really liked. And there's possibly a bit of an antidote there to astronauts as you would traditionally see them. Because what you kind of want from an astronaut is that they are very calm under pressure. It's a bit like racing drivers. And a bit like racing drivers, and you kind of want them to be kind of almost like automatons because they are piloting dangerous rocket ships essentially. But I liked that she found a way through Elmer and the other characters to give us somebody who has got personality to them, but also is calm under pressure. And that's something that I think you don't see a lot of. You either see the kind of maverick, break all the rules person, or you get the stick by the rules, stickler, follow every procedure. And it was not really nice to have somebody that kind of encapsulated both of them. So I've got a little list here of things that we might want to get into. And let's start with that comment that I'll show again from Laura about the egalitarian marriage. Yeah, I don't know, Laura, if it felt historically inaccurate or not. I think it is. You got that kind of stereotypical relationships. When I think about some of the marriages in my own personal life, and I think about my grandparents, and I think about other people of that era that I've known, mutually respectful marriages exist. I think they just maybe don't exist in fiction because authors feel like that needs to be a source of drama. And that's why, particularly in the 1950s, with the societal issues about gender inequality, those marriages are often used as a cipher for society. And that's not what Mary Robinette is interested in doing. She's interested in other prejudices and other things, but also maybe modelling that there is another way of doing things, and that you can be respectful of women if you are a man in a position of authority, and that's kind of, there's a way of doing things. Perhaps that's where that's coming from. Either way, I think it's really great. There is one aspect of their marriage which I don't think we can talk about too much at 12:15 on a Sunday morning, but their intimate moments are both detailed and not detailed, but are full of rocket-based innuendo. I think I'm going to leave it like that, really, without getting too much into it. For me, I'm not sure quite what they brought to the story, and I could have happily not had them in there. So it'd be good to know your thoughts on why you think they're included, and how they made you feel. It was just maybe didn't quite work for me, but your mileage may vary. We've talked quite a lot about believability. One thing that I was reflecting on all the way through is what I thought might happen if the meteorite hit today, and how our society is both a lot more advanced in some areas than others, but also but also not. So what does Laura say? Equal marriages, I was just said yes. Agreed. And that's probably on us as a society, isn't it? We need more fiction where we've got equal marriages. Definitely. Absolutely, definitely. Yeah. I'm glad you agree, Laura. That was probably, yeah. Um, leave some kind of safe for all ages comments in the chat if you're watching this back as well about what you think about the rocket-based innuendo. Maybe there was just a few too many instances, but I suppose it does speak to the humour that goes throughout the story. I mean, it helps to dilute some of the tension, I suppose, and to show our main character and Nathaniel in a context where they're kind of escaping the pressure and they're just being like a lovely and jokey couple. But I'm hopeful in the second book there's less rocket-based innuendo, I have to say. So yeah, kind of back to this idea then of what would happen if the meteorite hits. I'd love to know what you think about whether we would respond to that challenge in the same way. And we've had a model this year. We've had not a meteorite hitting. Well, in fact, we've got two models. We've got two models. I should probably moderate that comment afterwards from Stephen there about rockets. What would happen if the meteorite hit today? We've got a global pandemic and we've got the climate emergency. And at the moment, Mary Robinette Kowal's 1950s society is looking a lot better than ours. Nations have come together in this story and they've decided mostly to work together on fixing the problem and not kind of warring with each other. We don't have a society here where all the countries are at war for limited resources. We've got people coming together saying, okay, let's just work together and fix this. It's an international effort. And perhaps it taps into the differences in the 1950s society and our own. The 1950s is the growth of the United Nations. It's a society that is very much trying to work out how to work better together than apart because of the two world wars that everybody's just been to, and that realization that can't continue as a way of doing things. So maybe the 1950s is a society that was primed more than any other in our history to deal with a challenge like this collectively, even with the Cold War, because as soon as you get the two blocks on working together, that's kind of the big deal, and then everything else can follow. So yeah, it would be interesting to know what you think about all that. Do you think, Laura, maybe it would be better if the challenge was even more immediate and world-ending? I don't know, but perhaps there's some polemic there about that we need to get better again about how to work together, and perhaps the society that we end up in after the pandemic has been dealt with in whatever format that is. Then that's the society that could deal with the meteorites, because we'll have been through something together and eventually we'll have had to have operated collectively. And the last thing I just had on my list, I suppose, and we've got about 10 minutes left, is what we think about a story with no big twists and no big surprises. I think some of the reviews that were less positive about this story, that's what they picked up on. It's not a gentle story because it's a story of people dealing with massive prejudice and difficulties. In fact, there is one more thing we'll talk about. I've just remembered what it is. What do you think about a story that doesn't go to that place? There aren't these massive twists all the way through and kind of hairpin turns, which I think is what we've become used to in fiction, particularly as fiction has been influenced by film and television over the last 60, 70 years. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like not a throwback, but just a different way of thinking about how to tell a story, which is very internal and very considered, and you can sink into the vibe and the pace and take things from it as you go through. Also, though, I found it a really compulsive, quick read, which, having talked about some quite complex, knotty language stories over the last few book clubs, this was a nice change because it's still sophisticated, but it's not on the Gormenghast end of the spectrum, I suppose. So the last thing, and we didn't talk about this before, is about back to Elmer, I suppose, and she's obviously the perfect place to finish discussions as this is her story. So Elmer, as I mentioned before, is somebody who is incredibly competent and calm under pressure in her spaces where she's good. But she isn't necessarily calm in some of the other areas, where she has to operate. I'll pause that to just bring up Laura's comment there. It is an odd tone, yeah. Stakes are high. I get what you mean. Maybe that's why it's allowed to be like that, because we kind of know that it's going to be okay. So you don't need to worry about those false twists and turns because they would just feel cheap. I think that's possibly what would have happened. At no point does she have to really suggest that they aren't going to get to space or to the moon, because we kind of already know that that's happened. So yeah, maybe there was a kind of cart leading the horse element to it in terms of the story. So there is a sphere of activity that our lead character finds herself in, which is out of her comfort zone, which is becoming a celebrity. I'm not going to spoil the plot too much about how she gets to that point, but before she's an astronaut, she becomes a person of interest to the media, to society, and is suddenly recognised, and also in her job has to deal with talking in front of people. It felt to me, and it's interesting because when I watched the author present, she comes across as being somebody who is very comfortable with performance. Obviously there's the puppeteer side, there's the audio side, but I wonder if some of this comes from her own experience. Elmer is terrified. She's got a crippling anxiety of public speaking and presenting to people. Some of this seems to be just part of who she is, and some of it comes from very specific episodes in her life and her upbringing, which I'm sure will resonate with a lot of you watching, because they're challenges everybody goes through. And figuring out how to talk to people in a way that doesn't make you freak out is a real challenge. So what this allows the author to do in the story is to talk about anxiety, mental health, and medicating for it, and that place in society. And there's a real moment, which if you've read the books, you will be able to picture, and I'm not going to spoil, that's late on, where she manages to own that anxiety and that experience and turn it into something that's a power rather than something she's scared and afraid of. I thought this was interesting for two reasons. One of which it is a complexity of her character, which is a nice layer and a nice contrast, I think, with the competency in her own spheres that she's happy with. But also that it starts to speak to what's happening in American society in the 1950s, which is the boom time in medication for anxiety and also for the beginnings of the growth of psychotherapy and psychology. This is a very kind of personal way of doing it. And I think it also speaks to me of how the author thinks we should be considerative. No word I can't even say on a Sunday afternoon. How we should consider the people in the public eye and their own challenges with anxiety and things, and that it's a challenge for some people, even if they're brilliant at something, to also be brilliant at communicating about that thing, and that we should all be kinder to people because we don't know what's going on in their heads when we see them standing up in front of us. Laura, let's have a little look and see what Laura says. I really enjoyed the portrait of Elmer's anxiety, how she managed both it and the stigma attached. It felt realistic, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's taken from the author's experience. Yeah, I had exactly the same thought, that it had a ring of truth to me, that maybe even if it wasn't the author, I wouldn't be surprised if it was authors that she knew, or performers that she knew perhaps, or creators that she knew that had this same issue, that you can be articulate in writing or in mathematics, but it can be difficult to be articulate when presenting to people and having that persona. And I can definitely identify with that. I hope that I'm not communicating anxiety in this forum, but it's been about practicing that for me, and I can appreciate the journey that the author has gone on. So we've only got a few minutes left of our chat. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you've read the book and this has chimed in with you and your feelings on it, then that's brilliant. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to the people who have commented. Thanks to Laura for all of your thoughts on this. You've definitely made me excited for the second book, knowing that it's even a step on from this one, and that some of my views on it are shared by other people. That's really appreciated. I've just got some admin and some announcements to make to finish off the video, and then I'll let you all go about your Sundays. Now, and here's the exciting news. So our next book clubs aren't just book clubs on their own. They are part of Cosmere Festival 2020. So the festival will be kicking off in just under a month. At the moment, we're working really hard on the programme and getting it all together, and we'll be starting to announce that quite soon. I would recommend following us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, subscribing to our YouTube channel. These are all the formats that we're going to be sharing the news about the programme as it comes out, and also individual events that are coming as part of the festival programme. So I highly recommend you do at least one of those so you get notified when we've got some news to share. But what we have already announced are the book clubs that are going to feature as part of the festival. So the first one of those is going to be on the last Sunday of October. That is the second day of the festival proper and the third day of activity. And we're going to be talking about this book, The Book of Coley by M.R. Carey. I'm really looking forward to reading this one. I'm going to be reading it fresh just before we talk about it, like I always do. So my mind is bubbling over with thoughts. So this is going to be on my book stand, reading for the next few weeks. This is a kind of deadly, post-apocalyptic-y kind of world. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. And then the second Sunday of the festival, we're going to be tackling a slimmer book, and also talking, I think, more broadly about post-apocalyptic fiction, and perhaps talking about quite a lot of the stories that the book club has talked about over the last few months, and also the stories that we're going to hear from in the festival programme, because we're going to have authors talking about their work. And that's Anna Kavan Ice, which is a nice slim little volume, which again is set in this case, a very cold, dying planet, which I'm really looking forward to. And just for the festival, we are also running one additional book club, which is aimed more at young adult readers. Of course, it's open to everybody, but it's going to be on a Friday morning rather than a Sunday. And we're going to be talking about this book, Veronica Roth, Chosen Ones. The reason I picked this is because it talks about what happens to young people when they've survived the end of the world, and then how they deal with that in the future. This feels to me incredibly important for 2020 and for what 2021 is going to feel like for everybody. Now, if you can't tune into that Friday one and you want to hear me talk about that book, we will have it, of course, available on our YouTube channel afterwards for people to enjoy. So don't feel like you've got to miss out. But of course, it's also the kind of thing you can just have on in the background if you're working from home and listen to it, and even reply in the comments if you're allowed to do so. So you can head over to our website if you want to see more details about those events in particular. That's also where we're going to have more information about the whole programme, and we'll link to that from our social media as things are announced. My final two pitches are to just also mention again the Ko-Fi kind of small crowdfunding amounts link that you can see on the screen at the moment, where you can give the festival some extra cash to help us pay for the services we need for the book club. And also, I'd highly recommend you head over to our YouTube channel, Some of you are on there already. If not, you can just search Cosmere Festival and we'll be there right at the top. Subscribe to us. It really helps YouTube think that we are worth recommending to people. And you can get some of the other content that we've produced about books. You can watch back the End of the World Reading Club, and also you can already watch videos about books that I buy and books that I own, and there'll be more of that stuff to come in the future. So thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed the experience, and if you've not read this book previously, that this inspires you to go and do so. Continue to leave comments in the chat on these videos afterwards, because we do read everything and we'll respond as well. And we really look forward to seeing you in a month's time for what is looking like a brilliant festival programme. So till then, stay safe and we'll see you soon.